much for the kind invitation and hospitality while we're here. It's been almost a year since I've been in Panama City. I've been here many dozens of times over the years, and see my special friends from Sinan. And so in my last assignment, I oversaw the counter-drug mission from the Joint Interagency Task Force South, in which Panama is a strong partner, and many of your countries have representation as well. So I want to back out a little bit from the scheduled topic of coercive diplomacy, and I want to introduce you to two expressions or terms, if I may. The first one I want you to listen to is this idea of the erosion of permissiveness. The erosion of permissiveness. And this, I've come to this point of looking at it this way after spending many years working in national security and looking at the threat landscape evolve. The second term I want to introduce you to is an expression that we say in English, VUCA, and it's the letters V-U-C-A, which stand for vulnerable, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. Vulnerable, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And so these are ideas, as we engage in the globe, the world is getting more vulnerable, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. I think we can all agree to that. And so this idea of the erosion of permissiveness, I want to use a metaphor of the oxygen in this room. I think I remember from my science class in high school that you have to have 21% oxygen in the room in order to be fully functional as a human, right? None of us have contemplated how much oxygen is in the room since we came in here. And so as the oxygen decreases in the room, you start to lose cognitive ability, you start to have physiological impacts of a lack of oxygen in your body. And so I think this is a useful metaphor for us to understand what I mean by the erosion of permissiveness. And so what shape does the erosion of permissiveness take? And I'm going to talk about a bunch of things. Some of them you're probably going to be familiar with, and some of them you may not have spent much time thinking about. And these are in no particular order, but cyber effects. So distributed denial of service attacks, right? This is happening around the globe. As we've gotten more technologically capable, we find that our industrial control systems that run our pipelines and our electric grids and all these different elements of critical infrastructure all have a cyber threat surface area that's exposed for adversarial manipulation, right? And so these ideas behind the distributed denial of services affects our critical infrastructure and our ability to function. The next thing I'd like to touch on briefly is the increasing amount of artificial intelligence that's in the world, the ubiquity of artificial intelligence, if I can. So I've heard it estimated that somewhere between 80 and 90% of all content on the internet by the year 2030 is going to be artificially generated. What can you trust? What can't you trust? What's disinformation, what's misinformation, what's information that's used out of context. Which brings me to my next idea, and this idea is malign influence. And so if you look back in our global history, Joseph Stalin, the Soviet leader, created disinformation as a way to help control population back in 1932. And so disinformation and misinformation are close cousins. But I would argue that the tradecraft of malign activities has evolved a little bit to use information. But it's information that's used in a way that's not contextually accurate. And so it is misleading by virtue of using it. And so the tradecraft that we've seen evolved, and we've all heard the expressions when we talk about cyber and social media information space, the use of bots and trolls. And so if anyone's unfamiliar with bots or trolls, bots are computer-generated propagation of a message or an activity. A bot does something at a computer speed. It's designed to do something based on the algorithm that backs it up. And trolls are people people that operate at people speeds, right? And so what's interesting is this idea of scale and speed behind what a bot does. And so if an algorithm is designed to mislead you on a particular issue, you might be able to fire 1 million messages in a social media platform in a matter of seconds. And it would take a troll much longer to do that. And so this is one of the ways that, that this information is propagated at scale and speed. And I spent a lot of time thinking about this because I spent a lot of time thinking about it as it related to election security in the United States in my previous job. But the one thing I would tell you is please don't underestimate the utility of these bots and trolls and the use of those things by adversaries in your countries, because it's happening, and it's happening globally. All right? So when it comes to national security threats, many times we think of state actors. And we have many state actors that are in play around the globe in influence operations. But we've also seen a rise in non-state actors. And we talk many times in these kinds of fora about transnational criminal organizations. But we have other non-state actors that have malign objectives in our countries. And then the other thing that I would bring up, and this is probably intuitively obvious to most of you, but we're retreating some from globalization. So we raced through the 1990s to globalize the world because under the presumption that we would all benefit from, to use a nautical metaphor, a rising tide lifts all boats. But with some of the things that we've seen with supply chain, COVID impacts, Russia invading Ukraine, and other things like that, we've found that the supply chain's a lot more fragile than perhaps we thought it was. And so as we retreat to figure out what the new normal looks like in a globalized economy, in a globalized world, these are things that are going to erode our permissiveness as well. When we partner with other countries that provide us favorable lending terms in projects and infrastructure and critical infrastructure and communications infrastructure and those sorts of things, having favorable lending terms and accepting gifts from countries that are working with us on these sorts of things can then be leveraged. And really this is the coercive diplomacy angle. If one has leverage over you, then they may exercise it in a time of crisis or in a time of need. And along with that, I would argue, particularly a couple of the speakers had talked about 5G, 6G, 7G, so on and so forth. As we continue to evolve what our telecommunications infrastructure looks like and our ability to communicate effectively, I would expect that there are going to be challenges to each of our, what I would call continuity of government. We want our government to be able to operate in crisis times, right? And so are you capable of operating in crisis times if your command and control architecture is predicated on a system that's vulnerable or poorly designed or not sufficiently secure? I had this conversation with a friend the other day. We were talking about tactical and strategic warning. And these are things that came up in the nuclear age in our world. And so for decades, we had this ability to understand what adversaries were doing on a tactical level and at a strategic level based on our ability to collect intelligence. So we would get adequate amount of tactical warning or strategic warning so that we could posture ourselves accordingly to act. I would argue that in this modern age of cyber effects, many times you don't know that you've been the recipient of a cyber attack until after the fact. Sometimes days after the fact. Certainly attribution of the cyber effects might take you days or weeks or months after the fact. And so your strategic and tactical warning times in this context is actually now negative. So it happened to you, you didn't know it, and then you figure it out later once the effect has already been had. And so what do you do about this in a VUCA environment? And so I wanted to kind of plant this seed of an idea that the oxygen in the room, to use the metaphor again, is actually going down. and we're unaware of it because it hasn't affected our ability to function. But as we learn how to operate in a VUCA environment, I think it's highly useful to be very clear-eyed, to have a clear-eyed understanding of each of our national interests, right? To back out and take the time to clearly define what's in the national interest so that you can pursue those things in a clear-eyed fashion. I like this idea of establishing information domain awareness, is what I call it. But the idea of understanding what kind of malign activities and actors are operating in a way that could be influencing perception or behavior, whether it's an election or whether it's an economic decision that a population has to make as it relates to another sovereign, to understand what malign activities look like and to develop laws and policies to help guard against or mitigate those sorts of threats. And at the end of the day, each of our countries wants to be able to and must be able to exercise our own sovereign interest. And all of these things can work against our ability to exercise what's in our sovereign interest. And so I think I'll conclude with this idea again of the oxygen in the room. You didn't think about it today. I didn't think about it until I looked at my notes. But you just presume that you're always going to have freedom of maneuver and freedom of navigation and free access to all the things that you've always had free access to. But we need to be mindful of the fact that there is an erosion of permissiveness and understand where those erosions are taking place so that we can mitigate them in a way that serves our own national interests and serves the interests of like-minded nations in a way that keeps us safe in a global environment that's fraught with these sorts of threats, with an expanding threat surface area, given all these technologies and capabilities. And so with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague from the embassy. Thank you.